All right, everyone. So we sort of talked about some motion theory, and although this course is not an animation course in the sense of like we are not drawing a two-dimensional character like a Mickey Mouse, like a, Popeye or something along those lines, we are, we can use techniques and ideas and theories that animation uses and apply those to motion graphics because there are some elements that I do think are very relevant and very can be used to sort of increase your skill and that kind of stuff. So we're going to talk a little bit about animation. And we're going to talk about something called the principles of animation. If you ever talk to any animator or take any animation course, basic animation course, I guarantee you they're going to go over these principles of animation. They're very famous, can't get away from them. So, in 1981, there were Disney back in the day, I'm sure you know who Walt Disney is. He had a studio and he had his sort of nine main animators. They were called as kind of like a industry term, as a kind of thing, like the nine old men. These were like the original animators. And two of them got together in the 80s and they wrote a book. And the book was called The Illusion of Life. And it basically talked about the principles that Walt Disney Studios and other studios were using to make their animations look better, make them look more interesting, have more, character and that kind of stuff. And these are the 12 principles, and we're going to go over a lot of them. And some of them don't really apply to what we're doing in this course, and some do. Okay. So the principles are squash and stretch, anticipation, staging, arcs, solid drawing, pose to pose straight ahead, slow in, slow out, follow through and overlap, exaggeration, spacing and timing, secondary actions, and appeal. All right. What is squash and stretch? Well, what it literally means to do is to squash or compress or stretch an item. Think about a character like Bugs Bunny or Homer Simpson or whatever is like, imagine they're like clay or silly putty, and you can literally, or, I think slime now is kind of the more modern equivalent. You can literally stretch them. Okay. Now, why would you do this? Well, it's kind of a comedic way of showing force. If an object was falling, what you might want to do is the longer it falls, you have the force of gravity pushing against the object, you can have there being a stretch, just kind of show that force. When that object collides with another object, let's say, I don't know, a ball hits the ground, or in a Warner Brothers kind of way, like Sylvester the cat hits a wall or something like that, the character contracts, it compresses, it squashes, and it's to show the force that what just happened. Like, if I hit my hand here, my hand doesn't really change size, but if it could like kind of compress, it shows the force of the reaction of what's happening. Okay. So, you know, this happens a lot where a character kind of can stretch or squash. Okay. If you ever take an animation course, they'll probably have you do the bouncing ball where like a ball is bouncing across um, the screen. And as the ball falls, it starts to stretch to show the pressure of the gravity. And then when it hits the ground, it squashes to show the impact that it's having against a hard surface. Then it springs up, starts to, stretch again. And as it slows down, it comes back to its normal shape. And then the process repeats and repeats and repeats. Okay. This is something you're going to see all the time in animation, especially like old school, like, Warner Brothers, kind of like Bugs Bunny and Popeye type of stuff. Anticipation is when you have your character do an action or a pose that sort of sets up the audience with what's going to happen next. Okay. So the way I kind of explain it is, let's say my hand is like this, and I do that. Okay. You weren't really sure I was going to do that, but if I were to do this and then punch, that wind up, so to speak, that is the anticipation pose. You see me do this, and you're like, oh, he's about to, punch forward. This is why a lot of times when characters jump, before they jump, they bend. And then it's like that bending, sets them up so that it's like, oh, that character is about to do something. And so it helps. It's this kind of mental thing that it's like your brain goes, oh, it's about to do something. Oh, it did the thing. You know what I mean? So like, here in this is something that happens in a lot of old school cartoons. Characters never just walk forward. They always do this and then they go. Like the sort of wind up, as I call it, this is the anticipation pose. Okay. So like if I'm playing, if you're doing baseball, this is the anticipation pose that gets set. Okay. Staging is the idea that when you have a scene, you're presenting the action, whatever it is that you're doing, in a way that's easy for the audience to understand. Okay. So, you know, the way I kind of explain it is don't think about how things would work in real life. Think about what's the easiest way to present an idea if this was like a stage, if this was like a play. Okay. The way I always kind of explain it is I have a coffee cup here. If I'm drinking coffee in real life, I do this because that's how everyone in real life drinks coffee. But that's not always easy to understand if I was a cartoon drawing. So if this was like a cartoon, I'm going to try to do this the best that I can. And I actually have coffee in this, so I don't want to spill it. But I would like drink it like this, where it's like, you know what I mean? The coffee cup is up. You can see my arm, my head is back, maybe. And like, do I drink coffee that way? No, no one drinks coffee unless it's like a commercial or something. But the point is, you can easily understand what's happening, right? Like, I am drinking coffee. So it's not about like realism of how do people really stand and position themselves. It's like, what is the easiest way for the audience to understand the action that's occurring? Okay. So there's this idea that if you can take a action and you can make the characters silhouettes that and you can still tell what the action is, then that's pretty good staging. Okay. So in other words, here's this cartoon duck who's a magician and he is pulling a rabbit from a hat. If I make this a silhouette, even though you can't really see his eyes or his arm movements that well, you can still get a general sense of what's happening here, right? Whereas here's that same character, right? And what happens here is like here, my this is the camera, this is the duck. And essentially here what happened is, we're seeing the duck from the front now, and this is the camera. And it's not dramatically different than this, but it's a little bit harder to see what's going on. You can still see the rabbit and the hat and all that, but it's like it's not as clear, right? And see how like here it's like, oh, okay, the character is less visible. So that's what staging means. Like this is one, I mean, you're not really drawing characters per se in motion graphics, but the concept of positioning your character, what's going on in your scene so that people can understand it, that is something that you might want to think about. There's an old saying in film, also I would say this in things like plays and, any kind of entertainment that isn't reading like a book, show don't tell. In other words, like you don't have to, this is a visual medium. You don't have to explain people in text or in voiceovers what's happening. You should be able to tell from the positioning of the characters how things are. So here it's like, okay, you know, this character looks stressed out. Even though we can't really see their facial expressions, their body language, kind of shows that. This person is walking against the wind. How do I know that? Well, we can see her hair movement. Her body's kind of angled in, kind of like when you're fighting against the wind, right? She has items that are literally blowing in the wind, like her scarf and what looks like her pocketbook. Okay. Arcs. Things in real life very rarely. move in a straight line. So if you were throwing a baseball, and here's the baseball. If you threw a baseball, I don't care how good you are, a baseball in real life does not move in a straight line. A lot of this is because of the way gravity works. Gravity is constantly pushing down, so it's almost impossible for an object being thrown to go in a straight line. Maybe if you're in space, that would work. But anywhere on Earth or any place that has gravity, that would not work. So instead, what would happen is my ball, the baseball, would kind of go like this. This is an arc, okay? It's not a huge arc, but it's still an arc. You know what I mean? When you if I move my arm, this is an arc. If you could watch this, it's going in an arc. Okay. So when you animate things like, if I were animating a ball, if this was a ball and it's bouncing, rather than doing something like this, which is not really the way it would work, I would animate it more like this. These are arcs, and this is more of the movement that the objects would really go in. Okay. So that's what it means when we say arcs. Okay. The movement of objects is in an arc, not in a linear straight line a lot of times. Now, we don't always have to do that in motion graphics. Motion graphics don't exist always in the real world. But if you wanted something to like maybe bounce or something like that, arcs would feel a little bit more natural. This is something that doesn't really apply here. This is something called solid drawing. Solid drawing has to do when you draw a two-dimensional character, and that the two-dimensional character doesn't feel flat. If you ever watch South Park characters feel flat. And the reason for that is they're not really drawn in a way that has immense depth. Okay. Compare this to like, I don't know, Homer Simpson. Now, Homer Simpson is also a two-dimensional drawing, but he has more depth. And the reason why is it's like he has his the way he's positioned his legs and his arm, this is in front of this, there's like all of these slight things that give Homer Simpson a three-dimensional feel. The fact that he's also a three-quarters view to the camera, things like that. That doesn't really exist here for the South Park characters. They don't really feel, they feel like circles and, it feels like construction paper, right? It doesn't feel like these have real depth. Like this is not a sphere, it's a circle. This is not a, you know, this is not a three-dimensional hat. It's like literally, rectangles and ovals on top of each other. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? And that's really what solid drawing means. So unless you really are trying to go for a super flat style, like South Park, there's a couple other ones like that, but like this is what solid drawing means, where it's like, yes, you are drawing a two-dimensional character, but it should still feel, and this has to do with aspects of really good drawing, that the object has three-dimensional weight. All right, we're gonna skip past pose to pose. I don't really want to get into this. It does have to do with keyframes, but this has to do when you draw something literally frame to frame to frame. That kind of that doesn't really happen in motion graphics where you sort of literally draw an object frame to frame. That's really more of a two-dimensional drawing process for 2D animation. So I'm not going to get into that. If you really want to learn more, you could take a 2D animation course. Slow in, slow out. This actually is kind of what we were talking about in the last video, where it's kind of talking about how things really accelerate and decelerate. Slow in is when an object, if something was falling, it starts slow and it sort of speeds up. Or if something is, coming to a stop, if you throw something in the air, it gets, slower and slower, that kind of thing. So this is kind of, going over that kind of idea where it's like, okay, if this was falling, you have a bunch of drawings at the beginning because it's going slow, and as it's going faster, the drawings would be farther apart. And then as it's going up, it's slowing down. It's kind of like the baseball thing I was talking about in the last video. The only difference here is it's going side to side as opposed to vertical. But you can also kind of apply this to other things. So if I was throwing a baseball, it's like, I'm winding up, if I start slow, there would be more drawings. And then I kind of, go faster when there'd be less drawings. So once again, it's partly how two-dimensional would work, where you're drawing frame to frame. This isn't something that really happens in a motion graphics kind of situation, but we are playing around with the idea of acceleration and deceleration. Follow through is something that we haven't really talked about and is actually can be very useful. What this means, follow through and overlap is the idea that when something moves, not all parts of the object might move at the same speed. I'm going to try to do this. I have this piece of cloth here. And if I were to jump, like watch my hand here, right? My hand is going to move and then this falls afterwards, right? In other words, like the shirt, the piece of cloth I was holding doesn't go at the same speed as the my hand is, right? So if I, usually when I demonstrate this for my students, like if I was wearing a cape, right? Or I had really long hair, I just try to imagine me with long hair. I know it's hard. But like if I jumped, my hair would be following my main body, but it wouldn't when my main body stops the hair wouldn't stop. The hair would take like a half second, a quarter second to like catch up to the rest of me. In the same way, if I do this, like the shirt has to catch up with my arms stopping. So if you were wearing like a thick, think about someone wearing like a trench coat or really baggy clothes and they jumped, their clothes would take like a half second or a couple of frames to catch up with the main body. Okay. So, and this has to do once again with physics. What's really happening is in real world, you have aerodynamics. So this cloth is light, but it's also kind of big like a sail. And so the wind is literally catching it. And that's why it doesn't go at the same speed as my arm, which is much more dense. Same thing with like, baggy clothes or, something like that, where it's like, it's because of the wind resistance, it's not going at the same speed as the rest of the body. So here, this is kind of an example in two-dimensional form, but we can apply this in motion graphics. So this character has like a really floppy nose and floppy ears and a floppy tie. And as the character turns its body, its ears and its like tie and even in kind of its nose take a frame or two to kind of catch up, if that makes sense. So it's like it does that and the nose kind of comes afterwards. It's a very subtle kind of thing. It's not, if you watch a lot of animations, like there's a lot of times this happens. You probably don't notice it because it's only like one or two frames. But it's a subtle little thing that does add a lot of essence, as I like to call it, to the animation. As I mentioned, it's like, okay, let's say a character had a cape. Even though the cape is attached to the character, the cape kind of falls at a slightly different speed as the main character. Like I said, the reason for this is wind resistance. You know, this person whipping their hair, it's like her head is stopping and then the hair, there'd be like, they're not showing every drawing, but like there might be like another drawing where like the hair is here and then the hair kind of comes around and then you get that kind of whipping hair kind of motion. And this is what we call follow through. Spacing and timing. Timing is a big thing, which is like the action has to feel natural. And what I mean by that is, if my ball is falling, it has to feel like it's falling at the quote unquote right speed. And what that means is like if it takes too long, meaning like maybe it went for right now, my from the top to the bottom here is about 12 frames. 12 frames is about a third of a second. If I made it a second between this and this, that might feel too long. And then it kind of, we call this in animation floating, where it's like, it feels like it's floating. It doesn't feel like the way the object would normally move. You can also do it the other way too, where sometimes the action is going too fast. If I went from, say, here to here in, I don't know, 3 frames as opposed to 12, that might feel too fast. And once again, it doesn't feel natural. So, timing and spacing is the idea that like the action should feel natural. Now, that I know that sounds very vague, and the answer to that is, well, it is because, I can't give you some mathematical formula that says, well, if you do this, you do this many frames, you do this, you do this many frames. It's really kind of a trial and error. Hopefully at this point you guys kind of understand timing a little more because you guys have been doing keyframe animation in After Effects. But it has to feel right. And I know, I wish I could give you like some mathematical formula to figure that out. But what I always said is you just have to watch it. You have to watch it and really go, does that feel right? It's almost like kind of an intuition where it's like, nope, that feels too fast. And if it's too fast, you want to like, slow it down a little bit. If it feels too slow, you want to tighten that a little bit. Just having things being tightened, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but can really, really kind of take your motion graphics and animations to that next level where things really feel like they're like boom, 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 boom. They're like on the right pace, if that makes sense. Okay. So they're talking here about like things obeying the laws of physics. So like in real life, a ball doesn't take 30 seconds to go from the top to the bottom. It hits the ground in a split second. So if your thing's going really slow, it doesn't quite feel natural. Exaggeration, this is more specifically an animation thing, as opposed to a motion graphic thing. Exaggeration is the idea that you extend reality, as I like to say. Things still follow the rules of reality, but they're like just a little bit beyond, if that makes sense. So, characters' eyes bulging, or their mouth dropping, or, their arm even kind of extending a little bit. You know what I mean? Like, you don't want to push it too far because then your animation becomes kind of abstract and that can have its own kind of thing. But unlike say, you don't have to necessarily follow, even though when we watch an animation, when we're viewing Bugs Bunny or, Homer Simpson or Peter Griffin or whatever, we're basing this off our understanding of reality. How do people move and timing of reality? Off real people and real things we've seen, but you can still extend it a little bit. It doesn't have to be exactly the way it would be in reality. Um, so like if my arm kind of like pulled a little bit, went a little bit further than it would in real life. In real life, your arms don't stretch, quote unquote, the way you can do in a cartoon, and your eyes don't bulge the way they would in a cartoon. But you can kind of do that to kind of, add excitement, add visual interest. I usually say you kind of do this to add emphasis to an action or an emotion. Usually when people's eyes get big, it's because they're happy or they're, surprised or whatever it is, they're reacting to something. So you're kind of using the exaggeration as a way to extend the storytelling that you're trying to do. This is something that you can definitely do in motion graphics, which is the idea of a secondary action. Okay. Sometimes when people animate, they animate one aspect of a character. So it's hard because this is like not a great video, but like imagine I'm a character and then I'm doing this. I feel like a mannequin, right? Or like a robot because like I'm staying totally still and my arm is moving, but it's really the only thing that's moving. In reality, when you watch someone or like a real person, it's not really just one part of their body that's moving. Even if it's very slight, it's like when I'm talking to you, I'm moving my arm. You can see my shoulders kind of go like this. My head is bobbing back and forth. Maybe I have clothing that's like slightly rustling. Like all of these are additional actions that are, making me seem more lifelike, but also reinforcing what we're trying to accomplish. So, for instance, if I'm a character and I'm doing this. This is the main action, but maybe I want like the arm to move. Maybe my head is going to slightly turn. And that sort of slight term really kind of emphasizes the main action and makes it feel more expressive. It makes it otherwise your characters can feel or your animation can feel very robotic, as I like to say. It's very like moving statue or like animatronic, where it's like your character is just like slightly moving one part at a time, which doesn't feel as natural. So here, this character is running, and that's the primary action. But he has a hat that's kind of like bobbing up and down, and that hat moving is the secondary action that is supporting the main action, which is the character running. Okay. Lastly, there's something called appeal. Appeal for a vision for a character, like a cartoon character, or an animation is kind of what it's kind of the cartoon version of charisma. You know, a lot of times we say individual has charisma, right? There's that je ne sais quoi. There's something about them, the way they talk, the way they tell stories, the way they look, whatever it is, there's something that is sort of this, magnetism, sometimes people call it, that draw you to a certain person, right? And that's kind of what we call appeal for cartoons. Like there's something about Bugs Bunny, not only just the visual look of Bugs Bunny, but also Bugs Bunny's personality, the way that Bugs Bunny reacts to things, what he does or doesn't do that makes us like Bugs Bunny, and in a storytelling point of view, like root for Bugs Bunny, right? Because in Bugs Bunny, he's usually the good guy, the protagonist. We want, you're supposed to root for him. So you have to make him quote unquote likable, right? And that's what appeal is. What makes someone likable or interesting, right? Other characters, it's like what is it about them that kind of draw you in? And that's if for no other reason in the animation field, you're trying to get someone to pay you money to watch their cartoon, whether in a movie theater or, watch it on television or streaming and sit through ads, and that's how they get their money. So it's like you need a character that captivates people, that brings in their attention. And that's what appeal is. Okay. There's a video here that I'll play, and then we'll get into some of these principles and then, how to apply. We're not going to be able to apply all of these to motion graphics, but some of these can definitely be applied. Things like follow through, secondary actions, squash and stretch can be definitely be used in motion graphics, things like that. Um, so here's this video. There's a link to it in the This is so far the best video that kind of summarizes, in my opinion, what the 12 principles of animation are.
Squat. Following has been paraphrased from The Illusion of Life by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. Squash and stretch. This action gives the illusion of weight and volume to a character as it moves. Anticipation. Prepares the audience for a major action the character is about to perform. Each major action is preceded with specific moves that anticipate for the audience what is about to happen. Staging. It's the presentation of an idea so that it is clear. Straight ahead and pose to pose. Pose to pose is charted with key drawings done at intervals throughout the scene. Straight ahead animation starts at the first drawing and works drawing to the end of a scene. Follow through and overlap. When the main body of the character stops, all other parts continue to catch up to the main mass. Nothing stops all at once. Slow in and slow out. As the action starts, we have more drawings near the starting pose, one or two in the middle, and more drawings near the next pose. Fewer drawings make the action faster, and more drawings make the action slower. Arcs. All actions, with few exceptions, follow an arc or slightly circular path. Arcs give animation a more natural action and better flow. Secondary action. It's an additional action in the scene used as a supplement of the main one in order to reinforce it and add more dimension. Timing. More drawings between poses slow and smooth the action. Fewer drawings make the action faster and crisper. Timing maintains the appearance of an object abiding by the laws of physics. Exaggeration. Remain true to reality, just presenting it in a wild or more extreme form. Solid drawings. It means taking into account forms in three-dimensional space, giving them volume and weight. Appeal. It's a quality of charm, able to please the viewer's eyes. It's the charisma of the action.